Okay, I think we, in fact, maybe this is working. I'm not going to believe, I'm just going to stand here until I see this actually appear on YouTube because otherwise it's not real. Um, okay, it's
I
real.
think we.
All right, great.
Uh,
Real reality.
maybe, man. Only legal form of work, so we have to be good at live streaming. All right, so quick background on why we're doing this and what we're here to do. Um, Tlon.io used to just be this list of, it was just photos of everyone who worked at Tlon because, you know, what we make is who we are, right? Like how we all work together and what we think about kind of is the product. When we replaced Tlon with a site about, you know, more what we make and hosting and how you can use Urbit today, I really wanted to replace the about page basically with something richer. And so I was thinking what would be great is if it was just videos of me talking to everybody who works here. Is that a good idea? I don't know, but I figured we'd at least try it out. So Dr. Jonathan Paprocki, aka Poprox, is kind enough to try this out. So the basic arc here is, you know, what's your background? What are you interested in? And how did you end up working on Urbit? We'll do about an hour and there's no, you know, and follow every rabbit hole we can basically in trying to figure out, you know, what makes Poprox tick or, you know, maybe just as much as is relevant to Urbit and things Urbit like. But yeah, go for it. What, I mean, why don't you tell us a little bit about, I mean, I already know all this stuff, so it's kind of funny to interview someone when you know a lot of this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of it that I don't understand, so I'll probably interrupt you a bunch to ask you to explain things. But yeah, you want to start with like kind of, I mean, I'm tempted to just ask you like where you grew up, but you can start as far back as you want.
All right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'll start around maybe when I heard about Bitcoin, and then get through that like relatively quickly up to the point to where I ended up working on Urbit. First of all, I'm let's see my educational background. So I have bachelor's degrees in applied mathematics and physics from Georgia Tech. Which graduated from in 2011, and then went on to do my PhD in mathematics, also at Georgia Tech, and I finished that last year, which I'll get into what that was focused on later. But I first heard about Bitcoin in like 2010, I think maybe, and I screwed around with buying a small amount of it, and then was convinced it was gonna just like immediately crash to the ground in terms of like value. I was like, this is some weird scam, but it's cool. So I remember losing all of my money, like probably dozens of Bitcoins that were worth like $2 at the time, like on a gambling site. And it's like, I'm not even a gambler, but I just didn't know what else to do with it. I kind of had ever since then came in and out of interest into like the crypto space. Like I was mostly interested in like math and physics, but the crypto space, I could tell that there is something special about it. It was going to grow into something interesting eventually, even if initially it was just a lot of uncertainty and confusion, at least for me.
But wait, so was it you heard about Bitcoin? Like, did you hear about Bitcoin in some way proximal to the math stuff that you were doing? I'd imagine that maybe like Bitcoin white paper is interesting just because of the math involved. But is that
Right.
true?
Not quite. Like I wasn't interested in cryptography as an undergrad, but I was friends with a lot of people who were. And so I probably heard about it from one of my fraternity brothers or something. I
Got it.
don't really remember. But yeah, at the time I wasn't really interested in cryptography. I was pretty much focused was trying to like learn about quantum computing. But also I was interested in just mathematical physics around like condensed matter and other things that I don't really need to get into at the moment. But anyway, so like every like year or so, I would go through like a phase where I would be interested in like cryptocurrency for a while. I would, keep track of what the new projects were and stuff and prices and stuff. I don't know. I didn't really buy much of it. I didn't have any money. I did end up mining like Ethereum for a little while when it was new. I don't know, like I mostly thought that, okay, this is still something interesting. I want to follow it, to see where it goes. But I didn't think it was to the point where I was like, okay, this is going to change the world for quite a while. But eventually I ended up hearing about a project called Holochain, which I had talked about before on Urbit, but and I don't want to talk about it too much now because I've already talked about it. But it did get in the idea in my head that it was possible to run, distributed applications in a way that was a bit faster than just like what Ethereum was doing, where it was just like every single computer in the world runs the exact same computation on every or on all different devices. And then, and like, I thought like, okay, that's extremely inefficient. And, I didn't see how that could ever really scale. And then I heard about like Holochain, which is a different type of approach to running distributed applications that has a sort of notion of like local consensus, where it's like, okay, you have different groups of computers that all like, agree on the certain computation, but like not everybody does all the same computations. And I thought, okay, well, this seems like an interesting way it could possibly scale. But I was mostly interested in just the application side, the idea that you could run applications on like without a centralized, without a server, basically what Urbit has ended up doing. So the idea that, everyone just runs like, for example, the chat app in Urbit, everyone just runs it on their computer, but we're not like running a blockchain to make sure that everybody is coordinated at all times on what the state of all chat on Urbit is like. It's just you only keep track of the chats that you're involved in and so forth. So
well, Holochain does slightly more consensus than Urbit does. I don't understand Holochain deeply, but it's a little bit. I think you're right that it's like my understanding is like Urbit is sort of like extreme local, like to like the node and only the people that are connected to it. Holochain is like a little bit more these kind of like nested DHTs, basically like there are a bunch of hash tables that are somehow connected. I don't understand it deeply, versus like full consensus in the case of like Bitcoin or Ethereum or like similar proof of work.
Right. Yeah. So there's a sort of like spectrum of like blockchain with global consensus. Then Holochain is the sort of notion of like local consensus, and then like Urbit, is really like you can just run your own things on your computers and coordinate with other people's Urbits however they want. And the way I've kind of thought about this is that the further on to the end of the spectrum that has Urbit at the end on it, you can do everything else to the left of it. In the way I'm like in front of the screen, it's the direction is reversed. But basically, you could run like a blockchain on Urbit on your Urbits. You could run something like more local consensus based like Holochain, and you can also just have like stuff that you just run by yourself and just share with people like haphazardly. So so Urbit seemed like to me when I first heard of it, well, I didn't understand it at first, but once I got into it like really in full last year is when I realized, oh, okay, so this is actually an operating system or a project that is a good basis for all sorts of these kinds of distributed technologies that are distributed coordination technologies. And I thought this was, so my perspective on like distributed coordination is that it's a problem that nature has solved very, very well that we haven't quite figured out how to do with computers yet. But I have a lot of a deep feeling that because nature can do it so well, that we can get distributed coordination working with the right type of idea, and like Urbit is the right basis for that. So so let me explain sort of what I mean by that. So when you're thinking about something like a fungal colony or a multicellular organism, they display some level of intelligence. Like for an example, there's slime molds, the Physarum genus, for example, have been used to do things like solve optimization problems, like the best way to make a road system. An example is in Japan. Like they took the engineers in Japan took a very long time to figure out the best way to have like the rail system between all the different cities, like and try to like make higher throughput ones are more important and need less time and so on. And it's an NP problem, so it's not something that you can just brute force terribly easily. But yeah, eventually they figured out the best way to do it.
What is the problem about like in the case of, are you trying to optimize for, in that case, like literally like physically the shape of these things as it relates to the landscape, or
Yes.
is it, oh, okay, interesting. So
Yeah.
like
So they
basically
want to
what's the
like,
most efficient like line I can cut
yeah,
between
they
point
want to
A and
spend the
point B?
least
Yeah.
amount of money to have the most efficient, transportation system with the
Right,
rail
right,
system
right.
in Japan. And so, yeah, they came up with like what turned out to be the best solution. And then like some number of years later, somebody did an experiment with slime molds, and they made basically like a little model of Japan and put like food of
Yes.
corresponding to like the size of a city, for
Yeah,
example, at the different like major locations, and then like
yeah,
made the slime mold just go and try to grow on it. And it actually comes out with the same solution that the engineers came up with on how what the best way to connect the cities via rail was.
right, right.
So this sort of thing was really impressive to me because there's not any like the individual like cells in the slime mold colony aren't thinking at all. They're just really dumb. They just react to signals coming in,
Yeah,
and then they put out new signals based off of that. So
right.
all of the all the intelligence for this or the apparent intelligence for this slime mold has to actually be embedded in sort of the communications system that the slime mold uses to communicate with
Yeah,
itself. And so this got me interested in the notion of like, sort of collective intelligence, which is, the ability for networks to have themselves have like intelligent behavior based off of essentially having a very rich communications protocol.
but
And
wait,
so
is this something you came to like as a part of, or in the term part of your academic work? Like, does this somehow come out of your like basically math and physics? I mean, uh,
uh, partially. So this is a lot of this philosophy is what drove the development of Holochain, and the Holochain
yeah,
is also part of a larger project called Scepter, which is an
yeah,
operating system that has some things in common in terms of like end result with Urbit,
yeah,
but
yeah.
uh,
I actually remember that might be the thing I remember the best about Holochain, and when it was basically just Scepter. I remember there's like the first website, and there's like a set of even just, I think it was just like Google Docs, and they spoke extensively about trying to think about that project in terms of biomimicry, or like effectively, using biological systems as like their primary, I don't know, influence, or like the thing they're interested in trying to um, work in the same vein as, I guess. I don't know. But that stuff was actually pretty cool when it came out. I feel like that was in the early days of when I was first starting to work on Urbit. That was like probably 2013, 2014 or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Scepter, I think, got it started in like 2008 or something. So
Yeah.
it's older than Bitcoin. But like Urbit, it's actually a pretty old project.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the right idea. Like the entire design of Scepter was based off of trying to mimic the signaling, the intelligent or the very rich type of signals that biological systems use to coordinate.
Right.
And so when I found out about Urbit. Oh, well, actually, let me rewind a bit. So this does actually relate to like some of the math that I was working on during
Yeah.
my PhD. At least one of my side interests. So we'll get into this later, but my PhD was more about um, compiling for a certain architecture of quantum computer called a topological quantum computer, which we'll talk about later a bit about how quantum computing might intersect with Urbit at some point, but let's focus on uh, the signaling notion
Quantum
first.
computing. Well, wait, actually, can I stop you first? So
Yes.
at the point at which, because you were probably starting your PhD maybe, I don't know, what, like 4 or 5 years ago or
20,
something like that? 2011?
2012.
2012.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And so, okay, so at that point, even then, there is a clear concept of basically different categories of quantum computer. My understanding of quantum computing is really terrible, but I'm sort of surprised that even at that point, like the theory is solid enough that there are different, basically like almost like system architectures. Is that the case? And can you
Uh,
maybe like tell me, just give me the like dumbest version of what the
yeah.
difference is?
So the history here is, well, if you think about what a qubit is, it's really at the end of the day just a quantum system that can take two possible states. That we just call one of them zero and one
Yeah,
of them one.
yeah,
And so there's been, well, the whole history of quantum mechanics is just figuring out like, okay, how many possible states can this system be in? How does it evolve over time? What is the probability when you're in this state for it to like
yeah,
just turn into another state and so on.
yeah,
So the basic ideas behind what a qubit can be have been developed basically since the start of quantum mechanics, like in the 20s and 1920s and 30s.
Right. Okay, sure.
So people came up with several ideas on how to do this, beginning with in like the 80s, like one probably the most straightforward example are like photonic quantum computers, where they use photons to store the state of a qubit. And because basically photons, they can either be polarized when you measure them either like horizontally or vertically, and the probability of one or the other with a randomly chosen photon is just 50-50. And so you just say, okay, we're going to call horizontal polarization 0 and vertical polarization 1. And then we're going to like try to entangle these photons together in a certain way to start to try to weight the probability of measuring one of them in this polarization in a certain direction, in some way that coordinates with all the other ones, so that like when you measure the thing at the end, you get like a solution to your problem. And then like the one that I studied, like topological quantum computers, they're a lot more complicated, and it's too far out of what we want to talk about today, I think, for me to go into that. But basically,
this could
the theory
we can make this a 3-hour event, and we can talk about quantum computing only.
Yeah, but the theory for that actually, emerged starting in the late 80s. One of the greatest or most prolific physicists of our time, Edward Witten, came up with this idea that's related to knot theory called I don't know how much detail I'm going to end up going into here if I go on this segue.
I mean, you don't have to like. I think that actually, like, just the fact that the primary distinction is between. I actually can't even remember the label you gave the first one. That's basically like we measure this along 2 axes, which I'm guessing
photonic. Then there's like topological. There's ones with the photonic ones are also called like ion trap ones.
Okay.
The most common ones right now are like superconducting or plasmon based. But then there's
so there's a bunch of these things. I think that's all. I'm just like, okay,
there's 4 or 5 like major architectures that are being worked on right now. And besides that, there's also things that's for universal quantum computers. And there's another important category of like things called like quantum simulators, which essentially just do one single algorithm. The biggest, most important one right now being the quantum annealer, which I can mention later what that has to do with the context of Urbit. But like this is what the company D-Wave has been developing. So if you've heard of like a quantum computer that has over 1,000 qubits already, when like IBM and Microsoft IBM and like Google and such, they're like they have less than 100. It's like, what's this other company with over 1,000? It's not a universal one. It's something called a quantum annealer. So anyways, there's several different.
I'm just trying to. I'm like, all right, so you make some leap from. I'm actually kind of like. Somehow you're really interested in math and physics. So I get that undergrad, fine. And then I can actually kind of, without even any context, although maybe you want to give it, like getting into like, it seems like quantum computing in general is pretty far on the edge of like what people are thinking about at least at the sort of engineering edge of math and physics, right? Like this is like a pretty new area of like, can we even make this work? We think so, but we're not sure how well. So I can see the attraction of that. But then somehow you go from there to basically like how connect the leap from, quantum computing as a, bleeding edge of science or like science and engineering in a way to then this kind of I'm interested in biological systems. I'm interested in like how like network systems can, kind of like have a powerful intelligence that's like not displayed in any one of its organisms. That maybe is
so this is not a story I would say I understand well yet, but I do have some ideas about it. So the connection is through this field of math called category theory, which it's
Urbit people are familiar with category theory in the inverse, that they're not familiar with it.
So I just to keep things sane, I only want to focus on one particular aspect of category theory that I think could be really useful in Urbit. which is something called categorical informatics. And this is the kind of topic that can relate Urbit to this, biomimicry stuff and network intelligence, and also has applications in quantum computing. So let me, I guess, lead back to the biomimicry thing, and then like work towards the quantum computing thing from there.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that you find when you look at like signals in biological intelligent systems, like fungal colonies, multicellular organisms, forests, and so on, like all these things that are sort of like displaying some level of intelligence, and like they have these like self-regulating feedback loops and so on, is that the signals are molecules. And what you can do with molecules is they when they move through an organism, they get broken up into pieces, they get put back together into different molecules that have different purpose.
Wait,
And
so just to be, is a dumb example of that like a mold consuming sugar or something like that? You're saying they're molecules, like there's a physical thing that goes on when this network is like information is like a physical thing that it is consuming, or it could be rainwater or whatever. Is that correct?
Yeah. So yeah, there's things like gathering energy, but there's also things like hormones, which are like just mostly just signals.
Okay, sure.
Like so there's but both kind of fall under this idea that what you have is, at the end of the day, are chunks of information that can be pulled apart and put back together into other chunks of information. These are what molecules are. So mathematically, you could describe this in terms of like composition. Like you could have some widget A and some widget B, and you can compose them together into some new widget that like does something that you could derive from the behavior of A and B in some way, but is also its own thing.
Sure.
And so this idea of so basically, what's important, I think, about these signaling mechanisms in biological intelligent systems is this compositionality, the fact that you have pieces that can be composed to make bigger pieces, and eventually you end up with things like proteins, which themselves end up sort of like being little machines. So category theory is basically the study of composition. It tries to figure out what it means to be composable, and how you can like take two different widgets and put them together and get something new. And so it's basically like the mathematical theory of how you can compose things. And so for the last, I want to say 15 or maybe 20 years, there has been a small number of people that have been studying how you could apply these notions of composition from category theory to things like signaling molecules in biological organisms. Basically representing molecules themselves as sort of like objects in some sort of category that you can then combine with other molecules and build a new one. And so this has been formalized in something a bit more general called categorical informatics. David Spivak at MIT is probably kind of the leader in this field right now. He's invented a lot of these ideas. But the idea behind this is that you want to have information that can be composed, and this information also has to be semantic. So, in programming, you have syntax, which is just how things are structured, and then you have semantics, which is what it actually does. Category theory like formalizes this stuff. And what David Spivak has done with categorical informatics is to figure out what is the most sensible way to structure information in a way that it is both semantic and also like composable. So you can take different pieces of information and put them together and get new, better information, or new information essentially. And this has gone as far, like this happens at like a really simple level. Like you can say, well, I have Alice and I have Bob, and then I have Alice likes Bob, and like there's a way you can compose Alice and Bob to say that Alice likes Bob. Like there may be multiple ways you can compose these two things, like fit them together to say like Alice loves Bob, Alice hates Bob, and so on.
Couldn't you do it's sort of like you could say like Alice and Bob are friends if Alice both likes Bob and has visited Bob more than once. So if I know that Alice likes Bob and has visited Bob twice, then that fits into like the category of Alice and Bob are friends or whatever. Is that
yeah, that's pretty close. And
because when you're talking about like we're mostly talking about information, like category. I think of like what you're describing as information in terms of like information theory, not like information as we perceive it as, as humans, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely
Like machine
more information
measurable
related.
information.
Um,
Yeah. Anyway, keep
uh,
going. I'm following it.
yeah,
Actually, now I can kind of see the bridge backwards, right? Because like this is probably something you had to learn about as a part of like understanding quantum computing, I would guess. Is that
yeah.
correct?
So there are connections there. I'm working towards that.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, there's very simple ideas like Alice likes Bob, but you can also like go as far as Spivak has suggested, like structuring scientific papers as sort of
Yeah.
these categorical informatics options
Yeah.
objects. Like there's several different formalisms, but like
Is
one of the simplest ones that like I think can be taught to like high school students are these things called ontology logs,
yeah.
which are basically just flowcharts,
Yep.
flowcharts and like imbued with like some level of mathematics that makes it so like you can compose a flowchart with another flowchart and get a
Yeah.
bigger one.
Yeah.
Um,
This reminds me of the like some of the semantic web stuff kind of like overlapped a little bit with like the better part of it kind of overlapped with this, with the thinking being,
yes,
it's like, how do you improve search, right? Search is really hard. Right now, we do it by extracting features from unstructured data. But if we had really, really highly structured data, then you could use some of the, I guess, I had never thought of it as coming from category theory, but things that are coming out of like that general realm of thinking such that you can say, okay, I have all this structured data and I can basically in an automated way do things with it to learn about it much more quickly than what we do now, which is basically use machine learning to extract features that we can't even really necessarily trust to be able to figure out how things are interrelated. Um,
hmm
which
yeah,
anyway, yeah, kind of a
yeah.
sidebar, but yeah,
Yeah, no, the semantic internet stuff is very closely related. Like like if all the information on the internet was structured in this sort of categorical way, we'd have a semantic internet.
yeah,
And one of the main reasons that the semantic internet failed was there wasn't really a good incentive to make this rich information because it was extra work, and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
people didn't get like a monetary benefit out of it
yeah.
directly. And this
Oh,
is
there's all
actually
kinds
something
of,
I think
yeah.
this is
There's so
something that
many
I think
problems with that whole like
yeah, this is
set of
something I think
proposals.
Urbit could actually,
Yeah,
help to solve by, making data, belong to individuals, by signing it, encrypting it with your private keys and such. And then like, you can say that, okay, then you can sell that data, and they can, only parties that have, somehow, paid you or whatever you want to do for this exchange, can, decrypt it and apply it. And
yeah.
so I think that Urbit could actually incentivize creation of semantic data.
That's kind of interesting.
But
I've always thought about that on the urban side. I think the world is ending outside. I don't know if people can hear the background noise. There's like an incredible collection of sirens. Anyway, the way I've thought about it, it's interesting that, yeah, I think that part of it has to do with like user ownership, but a big part of it actually has to do with just like user interface. Like if I'm going to structure data, like just in the most practical sense, like, I don't know, as I'm writing, I'm like taking notes. Okay, like, the overhead of me tagging, I don't know, interrelating things and so on. Like, I'm really unlikely to do that in, Microsoft Word. I'm like slightly more likely to do that in something like, say, Rome. But it's just purely like you have to make it easy for someone to actually start to break up that information in a way that's going to be machine readable. Um,
Mhm.
which that feels to me like pretty much not solved. uh, like people haven't come up with really good ways for people to do that in a flexible and kind of like both like flexible and casual way where you just like do it naturally. But
Right.
yeah, I think you're also right that then part of it is, well, where the hell do you put it? Unclear.
Mhm.
Anyway, keep going, not to
Right.
distract.
So how this ends up kind of relating to quantum computing is all of the formulations, because category theory is so general. All these things that that they've come up with to talk about sort of classical level information, just like just concrete strings of zeros and ones and how they're related to each other, can just as easily be applied towards quantum computing. Like I don't want to use too much technical terminology, but basically the difference is you have something called a functor. So you have like sort of your syntax of what you want to talk about, and then a functor takes that syntax and gives you semantics. And all you have to do to use to get this to be about quantum computing instead is use a different functor to give you different semantics to your syntax. And so this has actually had some really interesting applications coming from like the quantum computing group at University of Oxford has done a lot of work on this to figure out how to like analyze natural language using quantum computing. And so I was, interested in basically the technicals of how quantum computing worked in grad school, but I also wanted to understand, the applications as well. And so this is just one of the applications I got interested in at some point, is this idea that you could use quantum computers to sort of analyze natural language. And there's a really surprising number of parallels between how sentences are structured and ideas like quantum entanglement. Like one of the things with quantum entanglement is that if you have an entangled system of particles, you can't really tell what the information that is being stored by that system until you figure out what basically the state of all the individual parts, but also how all the individual parts are related to one another. And this kind of is analogous to how with sentences, a lot of times with sentences, like you can't tell what the sentence is going to mean until you've read the whole thing. And so, yeah, this does actually have direct mathematical statements that can be made. And so if you look up, for example, like Bob Kowick at University of Oxford, he has written like a textbook on this, which I have over in the other room. And so basically all this stuff that has to do with categorical informatics, can be applied towards, things that we care about in everyday life, like, whether Alice likes Bob, but it can also just be used directly to describe like relationships between quantum mechanical systems. And so it's kind of a very like universal tool in that sense. So and another level, you can think of highly entangled quantum systems, like for example, superconductivity. The way it works is like you have very, very cold metal, like gallium arsenide, I think is one of them ones that works at very low temperatures. And like once you get it cold enough and you get very like a high magnetic field and other sorts of conditions that I don't remember off the top of my head, the atoms all become highly entangled with one another, and you get the conductivity vanishes. It actually goes to zero. And in some sense, you can think of this entanglement between all the different electrons that results in their collective behavior being one that has like no more resistance, infinite conductivity, as being sort of like all the electrons are sort of talking to each other. And they're, this entanglement is kind of like, there's sort of like be thought of as like between them all going on. So like the electrons show collective behavior based off of how they're entangled with one another, but like individually, they're still just dumb electrons. They aren't really trying to like think and coordinate in this way. It's really just their communication network that allows them to behave like this. And this sort of thing happens all over the place in condensed matter, which I guess that's a term that probably not a lot of people that aren't into physics know. It just means a lot of times the physics of solids, especially in extreme conditions. But it can also sometimes mean like liquids. It's just basically not like gases or vacuums, and but things that we care about that are kind of material science is very closely related, for example. But a lot of things like exotic things like superconductivity and superfluidity, these are all like end up being properties that emerge out of large quantities of or highly entangled systems of like electrons. Yeah,
I feel like now we've got, okay, I can see the connect. Is there like an epiphany moment though? Like, I mean, I actually see how these things are all pretty proximal, but I'm like, I think I'm also kind of wondering about the literal, it's like Poprox wandering through the desert, except it's like it's more like a jungle of ideas or something, right? And they're all proximal to one another, so I can see how it's basically like, okay, well, it seems like in order to study quantum computing, especially the theory of it, you have to understand a lot of the math behind. I mean, you're going to have to dive pretty deep into category theory and just like sort of like math behind computer science in general, because you're applying it to a totally different physical system. And then in doing that, and also studying the actual material science of how these things are built, you're observing the fact that basically like we have these sort of like emergent properties of natural systems that are really, really efficient, but they're composed of really dumb parts. And so it's sort of like, well, what is it about those systems? Like, are there other systems like that that I can like that exist in the, like, and then you kind of like slowly, it's not really like a hard left turn. It's like a slow kind of, be like, okay, wait, that's interesting. Like, can I find other things like that? And then at some point, you're gambling during that same period, you're gambling away all your Bitcoin, not knowing that you're participating in the same system of a sort, I guess. Is that more or
Uh,
less
yeah,
correct?
yeah. That's all. Sounds like you're following very well. So,
Okay, cool. It's funny because
yeah,
actually we've talked about a lot of stuff before, but I'm like realizing and talking about it now that I don't. I had never really connected these two things. Like I knew these were two things that you were interested in, and then it becomes seems like it manifests itself really specifically in some of the holochain work or the stuff you're working on at holochain and in that like ecosystem or whatever. And then I obviously knew about the math and quantum computing stuff. But anyway, so yeah, this is new territory for sure, which is cool.
right. So yeah, I did kind of have an epiphany moment, which led to me starting a blog a couple of years ago that I called the Advancedness Project, which only
Advanced
lasted
NIST,
what?
Advanced NIST project.
Yeah, Advancedness Project. I just
Okay,
like the
cool.
word advanced and advancedness.
Yeah,
Can't
it's great.
really
I love it.
explain it other than I just like how it sounds.
Yeah,
But
it's the Institute for Advanced Study of the Future is definitely just like the Advancedness Institute. Like,
right.
anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so I had so I was thinking about all these things for several years in grad school, and so my field of math, like I said, I studied quantum computing, but I really studied it from a more mathematical perspective, called
Yeah,
specifically for topological quantum computers, this field called quantum topology.
yeah,
And there's a handful of people in the field of quantum topology that work on a very interesting topic related to biology that it's hard to really say for sure, like that it's correct at this point. Like we will be able to tell probably with quantum computer simulations in maybe 10 or 20 years.
yeah.
But basically, uh, and I want to like link this YouTube video, but I don't have like a way to do this. But there's
We
connections
can
between
put it in the description or whatever, right?
yeah.
That's what streamers do, I think.
Yeah, so there's connections between quantum topology, which is sort of like this mathematics that topological quantum computing is based off of, and actually protein folding and also macromolecule folding.
Okay.
Um, so I'll stick with just proteins because they're a bit simpler. There's a handful of different amino acids, and basically you can
Yeah,
describe a protein by its sequence of amino acids, which is
yeah,
16 or 20 of them. Basically it's a code of some sort, and what you can start with you start with this code, and
yeah,
it's represented as a molecule in
yeah,
some way, or the molecule represents the code rather. And then like once the protein is built, it just kind of folds up really really quickly,
yeah,
like a lot faster than you might expect
yeah,
uh, based off of naive considerations. And what's really interesting, so what you end up with is you have in this protein you have like a backbone, and at each which which has the amino acids attached to it, and
yeah,
it turns each segment of the backbone is turned at a different angle from
yeah,
the previous one. So it's like
yeah,
just really like
yeah,
crinkled up thing that
yeah.
like kind of
These are these amazing, great renderings,
mhm.
right?
Yeah.
These are the
So
like red and blue and green like spirals. Like I think that's what I think of when I think of like protein folding, right? Like that's, am I thinking of
yes.
the correct thing? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And so, for whatever reason, you can actually predict what these angles are using methods from quantum topology, which a priori just doesn't seem
Well,
to really make any sense. Because it doesn't, because quantum topology is this really far flung kind of extreme area of physics that only really comes, as far as we know, comes into play like in extreme conditions, like very high pressure, very high magnetic field,
yeah,
close to absolute zero. So the idea that this kind of mathematics should show up and predict what angles, they're called Ramachandran angles in the
okay,
backbone of like proteins. The
yeah,
fact that they're able to predict it just doesn't seem to like really make
yeah.
there's something weird happening there.
But
And
predicting them, knowing a little bit about this, predicting those angles is actually super important to a bunch of like a lot of areas of biology and like lab science basically, right? Because if you're manufacturing proteins of any kind, like figuring out like and especially I think in genetics, right? So basically, like if you're manufacturing something and you want to figure out what are the resultant proteins going to look like, you like this is a hard problem or like an important problem that you have to solve,
Yeah,
right?
it's extremely like basically how the protein acts is really encoded in how it's folded up more than the
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
the just the unfolded molecule. Um, I don't have really any expertise in biology, and this is really like speculative idea. But some of the people who have been working at this, like Jorgen Andersen, who's the director of some place called the Center for the Quantum Geometry of Moduli Spaces in Denmark.
Amazing
This whole place that just studies quantum topology.
It's like a skyscraper. There's like 10,000 people who work there.
Yeah, he has suggested that what this sort of means is that proteins and other like macromolecules like this are sort of like specialized quantum computers themselves, which again, like naively, you would think that has to be impossible. Biological systems are too hot for quantum effects to happen. But we've found out over the last 15 years or so, like photosynthesis, the sense of smell, and the way birds know which direction north is, they all depend on quantum mechanics in some essential way. So we do know that quantum effects appear in biological systems, but we don't really have any sort of general theory for why. But at least it makes creates a little tiny opening through which, okay, maybe the idea that proteins are like little miniature quantum computers has some sense to it.
Yeah.
So like running with that, like some of the ideas behind how this could be is that the folded up molecule protein is actually like acting as a shield for like a quantum state that's somehow like encoded in the entanglement pattern among the nuclei of like atoms in the center of the folded up molecule. So it's shielding it from outside interference, and that like when two proteins come and interact with each other, what's happening is they're exchanging quantum information.
Sure. I'm not going to be able to tell you that's wrong, but that sounds great.
Right. So yeah, like I said, this is all very, very speculative, and there's plenty of reasons to think this is wrong.
Yeah, but it's interesting.
But
like the basic idea is like if the folding of those proteins obeys something that you can actually, I mean, this is a classic kind of like, it obeys the theory, like, and it's observed in the lab as such, right? Then you must assume that there's something causing that effect, even if it's not well understood. So it's still at the level of like speculation, but the observation is pretty thorough, right? Like that's what you're telling me.
Yeah, well, I would say there's not really there's observation in the sense that we do know that the Ramachandran angles are correctly predicted using these methods, but like we don't know like that there's actually any quantum state being protected inside of it. Like
that seems like a really surprising result, that maybe it seems unlikely to be accidental, just given how much, right? I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't know how.
It seems that way. There are some ways it could be accidental that end up being related to hyperbolic geometry, but that's too far out of this.
Anyway, I'm following. Yeah, that's a pretty interesting result. That's cool.
Yeah. So another thing is that with quantum information in biological systems is that like the problem with quantum computers, that the biggest problem that like all the current architectures face, which doesn't include topological ones because they actually haven't built one yet, is that they're very, very susceptible, to errors being introduced from the environment. And but the thing with topological quantum computers, they actually correct for errors at the physical level. So this is why. So quantum information structured using these ideas from quantum topology is extremely robust in general. So it doesn't have to go through this rigmarole of error correction that all the other quantum computer architectures have right now. So the idea that if there is quantum computing in biological organisms, then it almost have to be topological in nature because anything else is just too fragile. And basically, the reason this works is that essentially the information is encoded what's called like non-locally, which just means that like usually when information is stored in like one spot, one physical location in space, and then you like a like heat fluctuation might come in and like change a 0 to a 1 or cosmic ray or something.
Yeah.
But with non-locally structured information, it means that you could have like these local disturbances, like a heat fluctuation or a cosmic ray, but since it doesn't like alter sort of the global organization of how all the information is structured, it actually doesn't change the information.
Right.
And so yeah, the idea is that this might be how proteins and other macromolecules can carry information. And so so long story short, I want to get into like, agriculture and stuff too, and how that's related to this is that the idea then is that, and this is what my blog was about, which I didn't write for terribly long because I was trying to finish grad school at the time. But the idea behind my blog was that, I guess the biological organisms are basically just like large scale distributed quantum computers.
Right.
And so I think that could be a pretty neat idea.
But the crux of that is that like that's almost the inverse. You're saying it's like biological organisms are large scale quantum computers, but we don't actually really know how they work, right? Like we observe their success, but we don't quite understand like we can't replicate exactly what their architecture is, right? Like because they're not actually deeply understood in many ways.
Right. Yeah. Like we have to get to the point where we can like simulate these things on quantum computers before we could really test this. And one of the amazing things about quantum computers is that because they are sort of running on the same like software as nature, that simulations of quantum systems on a quantum computer are essentially just as good as doing the actual experiment. So that's why applications in like chemistry are thought they're going to be so amazing because you'll be able to run like 10,000 years of experiments in a day on a quantum computer, and pretty much be guaranteed that it should just work the same way in real life.
That's interesting. I've never thought about obviously think about, and we talk more about basically like, quantum effects on encryption and cryptography, but like, that's a wild idea because one of the biggest problems across pretty much all of the like any physical science, like any science of whatever, like not science theory, like, but like anything where you really have like, you're gated on the bottleneck of experimental results is that like simulation is like either expensive or it's complicated. It ends up being you're like hitting the engineering bottleneck basically. So the idea that quantum computing basically changes that throughput is pretty insane actually. That's a pretty fundamental change. Anyway, sorry.
Yes,
just
be very very crazy.
Yeah.
All right, so let me bring this back to Urbit.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we are kind of like, actually we're like, we're 50 minutes in, so you should like
so this does all does all have to do with my interest in Urbit. So so Urbit is made using a purely functional programming language. And as anyone who's studied functional programming long enough knows, category theory just ends up coming in at some point, and like you can ignore it to some degree if you want. Like Hoon really tries to avoid it, but monads do show up. But the reason it shows up at all is just because category theory is the study of composition, and functional programming is all about composing different functions into each other to get some sort of gizmo or widget. And so because of that, anything, I think a system that relies so fundamentally on functional programming would be very good at implementing ideas from category theory, like categorical informatics. Just simply because the substrate that it's all based off of is already kind of designed to just talk about things like composition. And besides that, there's the idea that Urbit is also kind of a like, in some sense, an almost like simplest unit of distributed coordination that I've run into, at least. Like blockchain being like one just kind of monolithic thing, and then the hollow chain being kind of like more like a localized version of it, and then like Urbits are just sort of like, this is a unit that you can set up a communication. You can set up communication with these other units, and then like I'm thinking that eventually once you have rich enough information like being exchanged between Urbits, like semantic information and maybe this sort of a categorically structured information, that you'll be able to get kind of emergent intelligent behavior among groups of people using Urbit, or at least among their computers. And I don't have like a good like concrete example of this other than maybe in agriculture. So
that's such a good. The funny thing is that's like really similar to some of the stuff that I talk about, or just like where my own interest in Urbit comes from, I think, but definitely from basically like a design or just maybe sort of architecture based, like how do people use things and how do they connect with one another. But I like the idea of how, I mean, you can almost look at it purely from like this, just, it's like, think about it from an information theoretic standpoint, right? It's like the more information throughput that you have between autonomous parties, the more possibilities there are for this kind of like, for them to, yeah, kind of like find categories where they can overlap and interact productively, and like form their own, I don't know, tribes or whatever, like cliques, cohorts for coordination. And I think like when you were talking earlier about like how it's like, oh, like you see Bitcoin, you see Ethereum, they're like kind of interesting, but they're actually like, they're sort of limited in their usefulness. I think if you're interested in what you're talking about, which has to do with, yeah, like it's like independent actors in a proof of work blockchain can't do very much because the information throughput is so low. Like it doesn't matter what you're trying to do, right? Especially like even general purpose blockchain like Ethereum. I mean, like, how do you, like, there's not a whole lot that like any individual on that, like, there's not a whole lot that one person can put into the chains. It's really like it's a lot of overhead. And so, yeah, Urbit obviously takes the opposite stance, which is like, let the individual or the individual node, have really high information throughput, the ability to connect with other nodes as quickly as we, can make the network work, and sort of see what happens. So anyway, in terms of what you're talking about, yeah, I think Urbit is kind of the only going substrate for the, yeah, like the, if you want to see, we need a good buzzword for the future that if you want to see the category theoretic quantum, like collective quantum computer of humanity succeed, this is your only option. I won't be able to like dig into, I feel like there's also like almost like a technical counter argument because of some of like what knock is and what hoon is in some ways. There are problems, I think, with the argument you're making, I think just purely technically, maybe. But anyway, maybe someone else can dig into that and argue with you.
Yeah,
but
that's
anyway,
definitely a huge blind spot for me, just because I don't really have a background in like any traditional computer science. Like I only really know math, and math people don't tend to care about things like efficiency of an algorithm and like or it's just it's like a lot of times a lot of times in math you just only care that a solution exists and you don't care at all about implementing it. And so that's something I've had to dramatically reorganize my thinking once I started working in software, is like, okay, because there's like notions like worse is better, and I know like the construction of Urbit explicitly tried to avoid mathematics to as much as possible, try to make the math very, very simple, to make it accessible to as many people as possible, which I think is very important. But and like the stuff that I know about, like I know a lot of things about how category theory and ideas from category theory can be implemented on computers, but I don't know anything about like how efficient it would be to run these things. So yeah, there's technical challenges that I'm completely unfamiliar with and don't understand yet. See what
I think at a high level, like I don't think we don't have to. I was just like flagging as like could be interesting to dig into whatever around on the network, in casual conversation. I think I'm following you conceptually. Like I think that, and actually it is pretty well, the line has been drawn or something. Like I get the connection now actually in a way that I think I didn't before. I think you want to say something about agriculture. If we want to obey our own time limit,
do, but I also really want to talk about encryption. We only have a few minutes left, so I think I'm just gonna.
Sure.
Okay, so so because we didn't really say like why precisely I joined Tlon. So at some point Urbit needs to be made protected from attacks from quantum computers. So there's most people are probably already familiar with this idea, but the idea is that probably in about 10 to 20 years, it's not for sure, all our major encryption technologies are going to be broken by quantum computers. And this is something that is less appreciated, is that this is already an issue right now, because any data that is still going to be sensitive and you don't want people to find in 10 to 20 years already needs to be encrypted using post-quantum encryption methods.
Right.
And so, so basically, if you have something that's like, so like most people probably don't have information that needs to be safe in 10 to 20 years, like your credit card numbers, they'll expire and so on. But some people certainly do, and governments definitely do. And so my personal goal of working on Urbit has been to over the next few years make it so that Urbit is secure against attacks from quantum computers. Right. And the sort of idea roadmap I have in mind for this is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which largely decides the encryption standards that, for example, the U.S. government and a lot of other countries use. Started a contest in 2016 to figure out what are going to be the best post-quantum encryption algorithms. And that's supposed to conclude in 2022. And so I work on the documentation on Urbit, mostly related to the kernel. And at least for me, I really enjoy this. Part of the reason, I don't actually do the programming much at this point is because I just don't have the experience to be nearly as fast as like the other people on the infrastructure team. But it is getting me a deep understanding of how the kernel works and to figure out like where we need to put these types of algorithms and what type, because there's actually lots of different types of encryption algorithms here, like key size and message size, for example, vary wildly with these algorithms. Like you can have maybe a smaller key but very large message sizes, or vice versa. And so for some things in Urbit, you might want, the small key, large messages, and the other ones you might want the large key, small messages. And besides that, the more kind of worrying thing for me is that quantum computers can introduce new attack vectors that just aren't even relevant at all right now to digital computers. So like might have to encrypt things that you didn't need to before. So the probably the easiest to explain one that I honestly don't understand, what it would mean yet, but is something that can be performed by these quantum annealers, these simpler quantum computers that we know are definitely going to become large enough to be used for certain purposes someday, but we don't really know that for universal quantum computers yet, which is that they can actually simulate a digital computer. And because until you measure anything on a quantum computer, every computation is reversible, what you can do is you can take, a simulation of a digital computer on like one of these quantum annealers or a universal quantum computer, and then like put a program into a particular state and then run it backwards. And what you can do then, what happens then is, like, let's say you have, some end state for your program, and then the previous state, there's 5 different possible states that can go to it. What would happen here if you run the program backwards on a quantum computer is you'll get a state that's a superposition of the previous 5. And so this might be able to like leak information in ways that, you never would have to worry about with digital computers. And this is a much more difficult problem than just swapping out algorithms, I think. And that's actually what would make this, a serious research project, and why this needs a deep understanding of how things like the kernel in Urbit work.
There must be that's crazy. That's my only, because I'm thinking it must actually, like, the number of sort of the number of possible states just expands quite rapidly as you move back in time, right? And so it seems like it's like, okay, let's say that Urbit moves to a post-quantum, the post-quantum encryption suite or whatever, right? So great, now we have, good sort of forward secrecy into a quantum world. I can rotate my event logs. I have just like the state of my Urbit, which is just this giant number. And then, but our future super intelligent overlords find my Urbit, and they, just having its current state, can actually simulate all of its past states and then pull my prior keys out of it and basically inspect its contents, right? Is like the
that's exactly it. And that's the thing that I don't have an answer to how to prevent them. But if you keep me around at Tlon long enough,
I would like to figure that out. It's one of those things where I'm like, that's awesome, but it also is not going to keep me up at night.
It's really only like very, very high value people that I think would probably have to worry about this sort of attack for a long time.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just the prospect of like, okay, can you put data into this and trust that it is secure far into the future? That's a pretty important guarantee in general, just for the whole realm of stuff that we want to be able to do, right? We're like, hey,
Mhm.
this is your permanent computer. You should keep it forever. Well, I mean, yeah, forever means like forever. I mean, yeah, that's important.
Mhm.
That part makes sense to me. I just didn't think the idea that you almost, yeah, that you have like another, a kind of like, risk, which is like, well, even if you make the switch later, if you ever had, pre-quantum encrypted keys in there that are going to be, vulnerable to a quantum computer, like anything even encrypted with those keys, even if you've rotated out, like you're going to have problems, basically.
Mhm.
Is that the right way to think about that? I have to think
Yeah.
about this a little bit more. I might not be like,
Yeah.
is that
No,
even possible? Because you've already
when I first heard
re-encrypted the
that you could
thing.
run programs backwards on a quantum computer, it just like made my
Yeah,
brain explode. I was like,
yeah, I
what?
know. Like, I don't know about that, man. Uh, all right, I think we
But,
should leave it.
yeah, you're right that the number of possible states in the past would explode very quickly, but that's also
Right.
what quantum computers are designed to work with
Yeah, right,
is like
right, right, right.
having, and they deal with absurd numbers of states. Like
Yeah,
a quantum computer with n qubits can encode 2 to the n bits of information at once.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so it's just like every additional qubit doubles the amount of information. So they kind of do like Moore's law on crack. So like
yeah,
having
yeah,
huge, enormous amounts of information to work with isn't a problem for them.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's
but
like hard to. I think that like the interesting one of the things about I think quantum computing is one of these great things that will just like no matter how old you are, it should make you feel old because it's like it's like people. It's one of these things where you're like, oh, this is a paradigm that people in the future are going to have this intuitive understanding. Like I feel like I have a pretty intuitive understanding of like how computers work. I mean,
Mhm.
whether I understand, it's like I can't design a chip, but like I get it. I understand the basic. I understand it down to like the physics of it. I get it. Quantum computers, definitely not. And I probably not, even if they become, commonplace in my lifetime. I doubt that I will feel about quantum computers the way that my parents feel about computers, basically. Where you're kind of like, yeah, I don't know, it works. It's cool.
Yeah,
Um,
this is probably the last thing I want to talk about, just because I think we've been going about an hour now. But I think there is hope, at least for the children, in understanding quantum computers. So
oh
like
yeah,
these ideas that like Bob Koeck, for example, have been working on, is able or and what category theory allows you to do is you can represent lots of different quantum processes just using pictures. And these are totally like rigorous. Like these pictures can
yeah,
be translated into equations, but you don't necessarily have to understand the equations. You can just manipulate pictures and actually be talking about like quantum
that's
programs.
insane. Okay, that's a
And
reference we want to put in the description because I want to look at that too.
yeah, actually, I'm going to be back in like 20 seconds. I grab a book.
Okay, I think my headphones are dying too, which is making this an awkward moment. Oh, I think that actually worked. Can you still hear me? Oh, but I can't hear you.
There have been efforts by like Bob Koeck, who is the author of this book, along with one other person whose name I'm forgetting, to actually teach these ideas to high school students, like gifted high school students. But there are apparently have been efforts to do this, and like because it's all just done with pictures, it's actually accessible to a lot wider range of people than you might previously imagine. Same thing with category theory, because this pictorial quantum computing stuff is all powered by category theory, and so that's why I have some level of hope that yeah, we can actually implement these ideas about like categorical informatics in a level that people even as young as in high school can understand and work with, and also the more advanced ones could also deal with the quantum computing level.
Right. Yeah, I got to look at that stuff. It sounds wild.
It is very fun. I spent many years tracing these rabbit holes.
All right, we should, yeah, let's wrap up. We got one question from the audience that I think is truly hilarious, and so Bear's answer.
Your voice just cut out. I can't hear anything. Oh no, I don't hear anything. I don't hear anything, Galen. been many years. Let me look at the YouTube so I can see. I'm just, so I still can't hear anything, so I'm just going to assume that you're talking about Urbit is a big ploy to pump up value of a digital currency for personal gain of the creators. Let's see. I don't. That's doesn't seem correct just based off of all the things that it's useful for. Like there are lots of pump and dump schemes in cryptocurrency, and you know, if Urbit was a pump and dump scheme, then it would have been done a long time ago.
There we go. Wait, you can hear me again now, right? I had such a good answer. I think you said the same thing I did, which is, yeah, I don't know how you could possibly put this much energy and work into something that was a scam.
The greatest pump and dump scheme of all time.
Yeah, it would be, well, it would be, actually, it would be, no, it'd be such a, I mean, like, really, like, it'd be a lot easier to pull off a pump and dump scheme than to do the work that we do. So, you know, I don't think OneCoin has quite as many, has anything near the workingness that Urbit does. So if you're skeptical, just go boot an Urbit. Anyway, that was fun, man.
Yeah, I had a great time.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, and thanks everybody for coming and checking this out. We'll throw some links. Send me some of these links, or like let's put some links together to put into this thing so people can like follow some of the references. And yeah, this is good.
Great.
Thanks, dude. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Keep it advanced.
Yeah, perfect.